Back in the 90s, there was no handheld console that could stop the Nintendo Game Boy juggernaut. Not the Turbo Express, not my beloved Atari Lynx, not even the Gamecom, but one system came about as close as you could get, and that's Sega's Game Gear. So it's time to compare the same game on both systems and see which one I prefer. Now, I decided that I should compare Game Boy Color games whenever possible just to make it a fair fight. However, I'm trying not to base my decision on the graphics alone because gameplay, sounds, and controls are just as important. That said, let's take a look at some of the games, starting with Aladdin. Now, Aladdin is based on the movie of the same name, and it appeared on multiple systems, including the Game Gear here. And as you can see, the Game Gear has some really nice graphics, and the music sounds very much so like the original movie. But I really like the way the graphics have like that 3D look to them as you pass by the alleyways. Looks really cool. I think they used animated tiles to make that effect happen. But what I don't care for is this opening stage where you're just running away and trying not to get hit by these barrels. I feel like I'm playing Donkey Kong. And then we get to this other stage where Princess Jasmine is running along with us, and again we're just jumping over barrels, and there's not a lot of typical platforming going on here, which I guess is okay. It's kind of different. It's hard not to be impressed by the graphics in this game, that's for sure. It just doesn't start out as your typical side-scrolling platformer game like I would expect. But then we get into these later stages, and yeah, this is kind of what I would have thought an Aladdin game would be, or I guess we're just trying to find our way out of this cave here. But Aladdin on the Game Gear, very impressive game. The Game Boy game has got its work cut out for it, I'll tell you that. And as you can see, it's more of a traditional side-scrolling platform game, actually very similar to the Sega Genesis game. The graphics are serviceable and it plays nice, but it's really the sounds in this that are just killing my ears. But overall, it's a pretty decent game. However, I just feel that the Game Gear version is a little bit better. Better graphics, better sounds, some interesting gameplay elements. Yeah, I would choose to play the Game Gear version. Our next game is the classic board game called Battleship, where you place your ships on the grid and then launch bombs to try to find your enemies. And of course, whoever sinks all of the enemy ships first is the winner. Now, what I like about both of these versions is that you can have super attacks where you can hit multiple spots on the grid at once. But other than that, it's your basic version of Battleship. You get some neat animations in between here on the Game Gear game, which is pretty cool. The music is slightly annoying. Honestly, I would prefer if it didn't have any music at all. And the graphics are a little bit basic, but that's fine for what this game is. Let's take a look at the Game Boy Color version, and as you can see, it's a little bit more robust, I guess. I mean, it's got better graphics, the sounds are a little bit better, the animations are a little bit better, and honestly, I feel like they kind of cheaped out a little bit on the Game Gear version of this game. But you still get the same basic gameplay elements, whereby you can fire multiple shots at once, which is really cool. So if I had to choose between the two, honestly, I would go with the Game Boy Color version here. It just looks better, it sounds better, the presentation is better, and you know, I think it's more fun. So fun that I actually bought a copy. Our next game is Bobble, and this, I think, was originally an arcade game where you play as this little green dinosaur guy and you're supposed to be shooting bubbles at your enemies and then popping the bubbles. That's gotta be like the weirdest play mechanic that I've ever seen in my life. And then after you pop the bubbles, you're supposed to collect the fruits and things like that, which is kind of cool, I guess. I like fruit. Fruit's nice. The Game Gear version here, of course, has some nice colors and it has some nice controls. As far as I can tell, this is a good version of Bobble. Now let's take a look at the Game Boy version. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a Game Boy Color version. The black and white one was the only one I could find. And the gameplay is basically the same thing as what is on the Game Gear, of course. The music sounds a little tinny though here on the Game Boy version. So as I said, I'm not really the biggest Bobble fan, but I think between the Game Gear and the Game Boy version, I think the Game Gear version is a better game. And not just because of the graphics, but also because of the sounds and the music. Next we have Bust a Move, which I feel is a far superior game than Bobble, but it does have the same type of characters in there. I remember first seeing this on the Neo Geo, and I got completely addicted to it. The Game Gear version has some nice controls and some nice colorful graphics. But the one thing that seems to be missing in all of these home versions of Bust a Move is the detail of the bubbles. They're just kind of plain. But the Game Gear has some nice graphics and sounds, and it plays well. Alright, let's take a look at the black and white version of Bust a Move 2 for the Game Boy. And I would say that this game plays well, and it looks okay, I guess, for a black and white Game Boy game. Of course, without color, it makes it a little bit more challenging to have different bubbles on the screen, so they added graphics inside of them, which means I have to think about it just a little bit more before I shoot the bubble. I mean, it's Bust a Move, it's just in black and white. There's also a Game Boy Color version of Bust a Move 4, which I think is a little bit more comparable to the Game Gear version. The graphics and sounds are a little bit more rough though. So if I had to choose one or the other, well, it's kind of hard to say. I mean, clearly the graphics and sounds are better on the Game Gear, but really it's the gameplay that matters. And I probably played the Game Boy game the most. So while I would probably pick the Game Boy Bust a Move 2 to play, I feel like the Game Gear version is the better version. Our next game is Caesar's Palace, which is a casino simulator, and you can walk around and play the slots or play craps or play blackjack or roulette or video poker and stuff like that. I like in this game that you actually get to walk around the casino. That's pretty cool. Kind of reminds me of Lynx Casino a little bit. Now let's take a look at the Game Boy version of the game, and it kind of sucks because you don't get to walk around the casino. Instead, you have this little mouse pointer that selects the game for you, and it doesn't seem like there's as many games to play either. So in this case, I think it's pretty obvious the Game Gear version of the game is better, and not just because of the color, because there's more games to play, and because you actually get to walk around as Eugene Levy. Alright, Centipede is going to be our next game, and it's a classic arcade game from Atari. On the Game Gear, it appears on the Arcade Classics collection, and as you can see, it looks kind of like Centipede, but it seems like it plays really slow, and maybe I've got it on the easy mode or something like that, but I don't know, I would just prefer it to be a little bit more frantic. Also, the graphics kind of make me think of the Atari 7800 version of the game. Then we have the Game Boy Color version of Centipede, and this is very weird having so many different colors for the mushrooms. Also, it seems to play kind of slowly just like the Game Gear version does. I do like that the mushrooms are much bigger in the Game Boy version than in the Game Gear version, but both of these games basically play the same, and they're both too slow, honestly, for me. So I think because the Game Gear version looks a little bit more like the arcade, and also doesn't have crazy looking mushrooms, I would go with the Game Gear version here. Maybe there's a way to speed it up, I haven't figured that out yet. Alright, here's Chase HQ, a driving simulator where you are supposed to crash into the bad guy and take him into custody. Anyway, this is a decent version of the game. It's got some nice graphics, and the sound is kind of boring, really. It doesn't feel very robust. Alright, let's take a look at the Game Boy version of Chase HQ, and the perspective is a little bit weird, but that's okay. I think I can deal with that. The graphics are pretty detailed in the background there, and this one's got some nice music to it. It also controls pretty well, too. So between the two games, honestly, I think I like the Game Boy version better. Maybe it's the music is swaying me here, but it just seemed to be more fun. Next, let's take a look at the Chessmaster, and as you can see, it's kind of your basic chess game. It's nice that you can actually play against the computer. It's fairly easy to select your pieces and move them around. I kind of like that. What I don't care for is the announcement every time a piece gets moved.
White captured. Black captured.
I could do without all that voice, and maybe there's an option that turns it off, I'm not sure. The graphics are not quite as detailed as I would like, but you know, they're good enough. And I would say that the Game Gear does a pretty good job of playing chess against somebody like me who has no idea what they're doing. Next we have the Game Boy Color version of the Chessmaster, and as you can see, the graphics seem to be a little bit more detailed. But there's one huge downside, and it's that little announcement music that plays every time you move a piece. I mean, sure, you don't get the annoying announcement of black or white each time you move a piece, but still that little music can also get annoying. But I guess you really don't need that, you can just turn the volume down on both versions. So between the two, I mean, both of them play a decent version of chess, but I think I like the quality of the graphics on the Game Boy Color version a little bit better. Alright, next we have apparently a European game called Dropzone, and to me this game seems a lot like Defender. You basically fly over this landscape and shoot enemies and protect your base down there. The Game Gear version has some nice color and graphics, and the size of your sprite is really huge, which is probably a bad thing because you want to avoid getting hit as much as possible. But yeah, I found this to be a pretty fun game. Now let's take a look at the Game Boy version of the game, and while the graphics are not as detailed or large, it's still a pretty fun game. I like the really large radar screen down at the bottom, that's pretty cool. Now one downside is that you die quite a bit. You see there's this volcano here, and every time something spews out of the volcano and hits you, you die instantly. So I wasn't able to get too far along in the game because of that. So between the two, actually I think I had more fun playing the Game Gear version of Dropzone than the Game Boy version. They're both pretty good, but between the two, the Game Gear is better. Next we have Earthworm Jim for the Game Gear, and it's basically the same as the Sega Genesis version, just a little more scaled down. The graphics do a pretty good job of mimicking the Genesis version, and the music's not bad. The control is just about as frustrating as ever though, I'll say that. It's a little bit more challenging to play because you only have 2 buttons, whereas the Genesis game uses 3. And I'm sure that this version has a lot fewer stages than the Genesis game, but it really doesn't matter that much because I can't really get past the first stage anyways. Alright, let's take a look at the Game Boy version of the game. Unfortunately, there isn't a Game Boy Color version of the original Earthworm Jim, but this black and white version does a pretty good job anyway. The music and sounds and the graphics, they all seem pretty much the same between it and the Game Gear version. And yeah, I know the Game Gear version is in color, but what's important is the gameplay. And as far as I can tell from this first stage, the gameplay is identical on both versions. They both have the same problem of only having 2 buttons though. Again, they're both identical except for the fact that the Game Gear has color graphics. So because of that, the Game Gear is a little bit more pleasant to look at, and I think I would choose that version. Our next game is KLAX, and I have to admit I am a pretty big fan of this game, although I haven't really played the Game Gear version that much. This is based on the 1990 Atari arcade game, and apparently it was popular enough to appear on pretty much everything. The Game Gear version's pretty good, although the colors are a little bit flat. The sounds are pretty decent though, although there is no boing sound effect when you hit the flipper and there's no tile on there. But yeah, KLAX for the Game Gear, it's not too bad. Now let's take a look at the Game Boy version of KLAX, and for a game that requires color, well, yeah, it's quite a bit more challenging to do. Instead of having color, they have designs on the tiles, which, much like Bust a Move, it makes it a little bit more complicated to play. And I noticed they kind of cheaped out with the perspective of the tiles as well. Also, the sounds are not really that great. I mean, of all versions of KLAX, this is probably the worst that I've ever played. With all that said, I think it's pretty obvious which game is superior. If for no other reason than the Game Gear has color, it's just definitely going to be a better version. Next we have Lemmings, which is a pretty popular computer game from back in the day. And this one looks a lot like the original computer game. Got some nice music and graphics, and it plays pretty well. Although one thing I couldn't figure out is how to speed up the game, so I ended up having to watch the Lemmings do their thing through the entire stage. And now we come to the Game Boy version of Lemmings. And this is a game that fortunately doesn't really require color graphics in order to play. So I would say that the Game Boy version is a pretty decent version of Lemmings. Although it seems to me that the speed of the processor is an issue here because the game feels a lot slower than the Game Gear version, but it's still basically the same game. So between the Game Gear and the Game Boy version, color graphics notwithstanding, I think that the Game Gear version is better because of the speed and because of the sound. I think the music is just better on the Game Gear version. Our next game is The Lion King, based on the 1993 Disney movie. And this game plays very similarly to the Sega Genesis version. And in the game you play as Simba, I guess trying to climb the top of a mountain. I don't really know. I've never been able to figure out where the heck I'm supposed to go in these games. So while the graphics and the sounds are pretty good, I think that the controls are just a little too challenging for me. Sometimes Simba doesn't want to jump when I want him to. So let's compare this with the Game Boy version of the game. And again, aside from the fact that the Game Boy is in black and white, the game is pretty much the same. The controls are basically the same. Simba can, roar at the enemies or jump. And of course, it's just as confusing as the Game Gear game trying to figure out where the heck you're supposed to go. The music isn't too bad, but the sound effects are just awful. Simba's roar just does not sound good at all. So between the two games, if I had to pick, I think the Game Gear game is a little bit more enjoyable. And although I'm not really crazy about the warbly music it has, I think the sound effects and the music are better on the Game Gear. Alright, next we have Marble Madness, which is a classic Atari arcade game. Now the Game Gear version here looks really nice, has that really great pseudo 3D perspective that Marble Madness is known for. This is also one version of Marble Madness where I have not had any trouble with the controls. Usually they're very dicey and trying to get your marble to move in a certain way, but the controls are great here. The music and the sound effects are not too bad either. Alright, let's take a look at the Game Boy version of Marble Madness. And honestly, I'm surprised that this game is as good as it is. The graphics are really good in this version of the game, surprisingly. And the control is a little bit more challenging than the Game Gear version, but the music is way better. So picking between the Game Gear and Game Boy versions of Marble Madness, it's actually a little more challenging than I thought it would be. They're both pretty good games. I mean, the Game Boy's got better music, but the Game Gear has better controls. And even though the Game Gear has color graphics, the Game Boy actually does equal it in terms of detail. So I think in this case, I'm just gonna cop out and let you pick which version of Marble Madness you like better. Our next game is Micro Machines. And of course, in the game, you are playing as a car or a boat or some other kind of vehicle racing other vehicles, usually on a desk or in a bathtub or something like that. The graphics are pretty good here in the Game Gear version, but really it's the controls that impress me the most. Usually I find myself slipping and sliding all over the place. Now let's take a look at the Game Boy Color version of Micro Machines. And the color isn't quite as good. The cars are a little bit smaller, and the control is a little bit slipperier. So between the two, the deciding factor for me is really the controls. And I just felt like the Game Gear had way better controls here. Next, let's talk about Missile Command, which appears on the Game Gear's Arcade Classics. Now, immediately I thought that this game is more of a port of the Atari 2600 game than the arcade game, because just look at it, the graphics and the sounds are almost identical to the 2600. The other factor is that the gameplay is really slow. I didn't see of any option that would make it speed up, so that makes the game incredibly easy. Alright, let's take a look at the Game Boy Color version of Missile Command. And this one is quite a bit different than the Game Gear version. You've got graphics that make it look like the city that you're defending. Also, there's a ton more missiles coming down at once. I'm not crazy about the animated explosions. I'd rather they were a little bit more random, but that's not a big deal. The gameplay is still pretty slow, though. So between the two games, I think this is a clear win for the Game Boy Color. It's got more variety in the graphics, and it's not trying to mimic an old Atari 2600 game. Alright, next let's talk about Mortal Kombat 2, and for the Game Gear, it's a pretty graphically okay version of the game. Unfortunately, there's only 2 stages, which kind of sucks, and also the animation is a little bit jinky, but the music's okay and the graphics are decent enough. Just so long as you don't watch it in motion, it looks like a pretty decent game. I can't imagine actually wanting to play this on a road trip or anything. Next we have the Game Boy version of Mortal Kombat 2, and yeah, it's just as bad. The graphics aren't too bad considering, the music is terrible, the animation is awful. So between the 2 ports, I mean, obviously the Game Gear has better graphics, but truthfully, I would not want to play either one of these. But I think the Game Gear game just has the slight edge only because it looks better. Our next game is going to be the arcade classic Ms. Pac-Man for the Game Gear. And right off the bat, what strikes me as odd is the fact that the maze is green. I'm not sure why that would be. Maybe green looks better on the Game Gear screen than pink. But other than that, the maze seems pretty accurate. The gameplay is pretty good, the graphics are pretty good, the sounds are pretty good, and it controls pretty well. Alright, next we have Ms. Pac-Man for the Game Boy Color, and immediately you can tell that the graphics are more arcade accurate, and in addition to the graphics scrolling up and down like the Game Gear version, the Game Boy Color version scrolls left and right as well. Now the scrolling can be a bit of a problem because it makes it harder to keep track of where the ghosts are, but this is still a really fun version of Ms. Pac-Man. So which game did I prefer, the Game Gear or the Game Boy Color version of Ms. Pac-Man? Well, I think the Game Boy Color version feels more like Ms. Pac-Man than the Game Gear version does. I just think the graphics and the sounds elevate the Game Boy Color version over the Game Gear version. Next we have NBA Jam Tournament Edition, and it's crazy to me that they would try to port this game to a handheld system. As you can see, the Game Gear version is missing the signature line scrolling that is so popular with the arcade version. Also, with only 2 buttons, it makes it a little bit more challenging to play because the original game requires 3 buttons. Alright, let's take a look at the Game Boy version of the game, and surprisingly the sounds and the music are exactly the same as on the Game Gear version, but both versions play pretty much the same, which is to say, not really good. I mean, as a fast-paced basketball game, I guess it's okay. It just feels so watered down, it's not really that enjoyable. So much like Mortal Kombat 2, if I had a choice to play one or the other, I'd really rather just play the Jaguar version of this game, because that's pretty much the best one. I mean, they're basically identical. The advantage is that the Game Gear has color. Alright, next let's talk about Pac-Attack, and this is kind of a Tetris-style puzzle game where these ghosts are constantly getting in your way, and the only way to get rid of them is to have Pac-Man eat them. The Game Gear version here is pretty decent. It's got some nice graphics and sounds, and it does a pretty good representation of Pac-Attack. Only wish that the playfield was quite a bit bigger. Alright, let's take a look at the Game Boy Color version of Pac-Attack, which appears on the Pac-Man Special Color Edition cartridge. As you can see, the Game Boy Color version is actually very colorful. And the music is not too bad. It's a little bit scratchy, but not too bad. I like how the ghosts have their own separate animations versus all being identical, but it's pretty much the same game as the Game Gear version. So if I had to pick one version over the other, I think I would go with the Game Boy Color version, just because the colors are a little bit more vibrant, but otherwise they're basically the same game. Next we have Pac-Man, the original arcade game for the Game Gear. And very similarly to the Ms. Pac-Man game, this is a very good conversion. However, they actually got the colors right this time. It definitely looks and sounds like Pac-Man, but of course the downside is that the screen scrolls up and down, which can make it challenging to find the ghosts sometimes. But this is definitely a good version of Pac-Man on the go. And we have the Game Boy Color version of Pac-Man on the Special Color Edition cartridge. And again, it's similar to the Miss Pac-Man version on the Game Boy Color in that the game scrolls up and down and left and right, but it definitely looks and sounds like Pac-Man. Well, pretty close. I mean, there's some weird Pac-Man sound effects that I don't recognize, but that just might be a limitation of the Game Boy's hardware. But overall, it's a good version of Pac-Man. So if I had to choose between these two versions of Pac-Man, I would probably go with the Game Gear version this time. I just feel like the graphics and the sounds are more arcade accurate than the Game Boy Color version. But both versions are great, you can't really go wrong. Alright, our next game is Paperboy, the classic Atari game, where you play as a Paperboy, and your job is to deliver papers, all the while avoiding obstacles along your path. Now, initially I thought the Game Gear version was pretty dang good because of how accurate the graphics are, but you might notice something very strange about how he throws the paper. Instead of throwing them to the left, he kind of throws them forward diagonally, which even if you completely stop, he throws the paper at a diagonal manner, which makes trying to get an accurate throw of the paper very difficult. But hey, at least the graphics and sounds are good, even if the gameplay isn't what I would prefer. Alright, let's take a look at the Game Boy version of Paperboy, and immediately you'll notice that when I throw the paper, it throws them horizontally to the left exactly the way that it should, just like in the arcade. Also, the music and sounds are a little bit more accurate to the arcade. Naturally, the biggest downside with this version of the game is that the graphics are in black and white. But if I had to choose between the two games, am I going to pick the one that is more playable to the arcade, or am I going to pick the one that looks more like the arcade? Well, in this case, I think I'm going to go with the Game Boy version, simply because it plays more like the arcade version. Next we have Prince of Persia, and I'm really surprised that this game has appeared on so many different consoles when it originally was meant for a computer. This game has some really nice rotoscoped graphics, and the controls are pretty challenging, I guess is the word. But that's a common thing with every version of Prince of Persia. I've never been able to get too far into this game, but the Game Gear graphics are really something special. It doesn't have that much in the way of sounds or music, but what it does have is pretty good. So let's take a look at the Game Boy version of the game, and naturally the graphics are not going to be as detailed, but it does control very well. However, the huge downside here is this annoying hum that plays pretty much throughout the game, which is kind of a shame because the gameplay is pretty good actually here. Of course, this could just be an issue with the emulation, not really sure. So I'm not really the biggest fan of this game, but if I had to pick one or the other, I think the Game Gear version is more pleasant, just for the fact that it doesn't have this really annoying sound effect running in the background. If it weren't for that, I might actually consider going with the Game Boy version because I think the controls are a little bit better. Next is Road Rash, one of my favorite racing games of all time, and the Game Gear here does a really good representation of the Sega Genesis game. It does feel a little bit slower, but I think that's understandable. The graphics are really good and pretty close to the Genesis original. The sounds are a little bit warbly, not a really big fan of that kind of music, but it plays well and it looks well. If I had a Game Gear back in the day, this game definitely would have gotten a lot of play. Alright, let's take a look at the Game Boy Color version of Road Rash, and it's got some really amazing graphics. Well, at least the background graphics anyway. The character graphics are a little bit weak. I love how smoothly the road scrolls in this version. The music is a little bit annoying, but you know, I could probably get used to it. So which game am I going to choose, the Game Gear version or the Game Boy Color version? I mean, I really do like how the scrolling is on the Game Boy Color version. However, it just doesn't feel like Road Rash. The Game Gear version actually feels like the original Genesis game to me. So I'm gonna have to go with the Game Gear version here. Spider-Man Return of the Sinister 6 is our next game, and this is a side-scrolling action game featuring your favorite web-slinger Spider-Man. You can climb the walls and shoot webs to swing and shoot globs of webs at people. You can also punch them and watch them explode. This game's got some really good graphics and some good sound effects and music, although the music is a tad bit too loud for me. Alright, now the closest equivalent I could come to for the Game Boy Color is called Spider-Man 2: The Sinister Six, and I like this game because the music is not quite as loud and obnoxious, but it's got some nice graphics as you can see. Not quite as detailed as the Game Gear version though. I also think Spider-Man looks better here than he does in the Game Gear game, where he kind of looks like a big kid, pretty much. Alright, so if I had to choose between these two Spider-Man games, which again may not be a perfect one-to-one equivalent, I think the Game Boy Color game here is better. The graphics aren't as detailed, but I think it's just more fun to play. Next we have Super Space Invaders, and this isn't just your typical Space Invaders game. They've really tried to up the ante in the gameplay. Each of the waves are just a little bit different than the other. This one's got some interesting graphics, some nice sounds, but it's really the gameplay elements that make this version of the game stand out. There's just so much variety in this game. I like the bonus stage where you have to save the cows from the aliens. You even have a boss to fight here at the end. And here we have the Game Boy Color version of Space Invaders, which is a little bit different than the original game. I like the large and detailed graphics that this game has, and it also has some nice music and sounds. So between these two games, I really like the Game Boy's graphics and sounds. I feel like they're much better than the Game Gear version. However, where the Game Gear game shines is the variety. It's not just the same stage every time. It's constantly mixing things up. So because of that, I'm going to go with the Game Gear version. Our next game is called Tintin in Tibet, and I really don't know much about this Tintin character other than the Peter Jackson movie that came out a couple of years ago. This game looks like a side-scrolling platform jumping game, and it's got some nice graphics and nice sounds, and it controls well. Then we have the Game Boy game, which, aside from the graphics, is exactly the same as the Game Gear version. It sounds the same, it looks the same, and it plays the same. Now granted, I wasn't able to get too far into the game, but I think if you're a Tintin fan, you'd enjoy this one. So which one do I prefer? Well, I don't have any real preference over either one of these games. Again, they're pretty much exactly the same. The Game Gear game is better just because it has color graphics, but I'm gonna call this one a tie. Next we have WWF Raw, which is a pretty awful wrestling game. The graphics are not too bad, but the animation is choppy, just like most of these wrestling games. The music is bad, and the sound effects are bad, and the control is bad. I don't think this is a good game. Then we have the Game Boy version, which is just as bad as the Game Gear version, without the added benefit of color graphics. Also, it's just not as detailed as the Game Gear version. The control is bad, the graphics are bad, the sounds are bad, the music is bad. They're just terrible. These games are terrible. So which one would I prefer to play? Well, neither. I think I'm just going to go back to playing pro wrestling on the NES. But I guess the Game Gear version is just slightly better because it has color graphics. Alright, well there you have it. There's a gaggle of games that appeared on both the Game Gear and the Game Boy / Game Boy Color. How do you think these handheld consoles match up with each other? Let me know down in the comments. While I've always been a fan of the Game Boy, I was really surprised at how much I liked the Game Gear games. With all that said, I'd like to thank you for watching, take care, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.